Greetings to all. Welcome to the lecture Historical Context of Modern Government. In this lecture, as we attempt to explain the historical context of modern government, we shall discuss the definition of government, the scope of the functions of government, also look at important debates that have shaped the idea of modern government, and do a critical analysis of the important work of Francis Fukuyama, work of End of History and the Last Man. Now, to begin with, we all know that politics, it implies looking into the working of the state and to look at the working of dynamics of power. Herein, government has played and will definitely play an important role. The idea and the concept of state has evolved over time, and therefore, government, which is an important element of the state, its work, its nature, debates on it have also evolved with time. As we try to understand the concept of government, we all know that government is an important instrument of the state. So therefore, the working of government has had a bearing on the nature, scope of political science over the past, present, and as well as for the future. We must understand that role of the state has been interpreted in different ways. So similarly, this diversity also comes into account when we take into account the working of government. Now, there are various ways wherein which the government has been defined. An important definition of government, it is the body, the apparatus, the power to make or enforce laws, to control a land area, people or organization. Now, there are various types of government, from democracy, monarchy to oligarchy. So therefore, when we talk about form of government, this is related to the set of political institutions by which a government of a state is organized. For example, when we talk about aristocracy, aristocracy is ruled by elite citizens, a system of governance and government in which a person who rules in an aristocracy is by an aristocrat, that is, people of the noble birth. Then meritocracy, another form of government that is ruled by the meritorious, a system of governance where groups are selected on the basis of people's ability, knowledge in a given area and contributions to society. Then technocracy, ruled by the educated, a system of governance where people who are skilled or proficient, they govern. So therefore, there are various typologies of government, from aristocracy to meritocracy to technocracy or to democracy. Democracy, it is a government of the people, by the people and for the people. Now, this is a very important definition by Abraham Lincoln, that is the idea of democracy, that is the government under the people's perspective, the people's rule. Now, democracy could be direct democracy or representative democracy. Direct democracy is often looked upon as face-to-face democracy or representative democracy, that is, it is a variant of democracy founded on the principle of elected people representing a group of people. Now, as we understand government through the historical context, let us take into account some important perspectives, quotes, ideas on how important government is as an important pillar of the state. Thomas Jefferson said, and we quote, "The care of human life and happiness and not their destruction is the first and only object of good government." So this definition tells us that how even in the past, the idea that government must focus on welfare has been an important aspect. Another important perspective that we get from the mandate, the nature, the scope of government is from the ideas of Franklin D. Roosevelt. Let us quote them. Let us never forget that government is ourselves and not an alien power over us. The ultimate rulers of our democracy are not president and senators, but the voters of this country. So that is how the government aspect, the mandate of the government has had a strong link with the democratic perspective, with the democratic input. And today, when we look at the debates around, when we look at the typologies of government, liberal democracy is an accepted form of government. Another important perspective on government and how essential it is to blend democracy in government comes from Alexander Hamilton. That it's not tyranny we desire, it is just limited federal government, the words of Alexander Hamilton. Another important perspective from Theodore Roosevelt, that is, the government is us. We are the government, you and I. So therefore, what we get here is that when we try to understand government, when we try to understand the historical conception, the context behind the modern government, the people element, the need to cater to welfare, the need to look after law and order has always been an important aspect. In the present times, the liberal democratic governments have become the most accepted and celebrated form of government. But this liberal democratic government too, or liberal democracy too, has witnessed evolution. It has witnessed changes. Now, dear learners, as we right at the beginning of the lecture, we spoke that how the concept of state has evolved over time. So, similarly, the ideas concerning government too have witnessed changes. The functions of government, when we look from the negative liberal perspective, it's only limited to maintenance of law and order. But with changes in the liberal thought, the positive liberal perspective looks at the welfare, the positive role by which the state and the government should work, looking at how the state policy must have welfare contours to it. So what we see here is that in the earlier times, namely one finds the mention of Plato's philosopher king to look after how city-states should be ruled by philosophers to cater to the welfare perspective, or Aristotle's classification of government wherein monarchy was seen as an ideal form of government if it is ruled by one, aristocracy as the ideal form of government it is for ruled by few, or polity as the ideal form of government if it was ruled by many. So there is diversity in the government structure right from the beginning of political thought and political ideology. So from democracy to monarchy to oligarchy to tyranny, the formal apparatus by which the government functions may have differences. But what is essential here is the important focus on the welfare function of the government is an idea that has always been there with time. Now one finds that with the end of feudalism, with the rise of modern capitalism, industrial revolution, here in all of it, one finds that respect for rights, respect for liberty, respect for sovereignty of the state became very important features. And herein, they also had a bearing on this historical context of the modern government. The Treaty of Westphalia 1648, the French Declaration of Rights of Man 1789, or the American Declaration of Independence 1776 are some important historical events to reflect on, to deliberate on, that how the ideals that they enshrine today they have an important bearing on the working of governments across nation states. John Locke's perspective on natural inalienable rights of man to J.S. Mill's work or important perspective on suffrage for women, all of them today have an important bearing on the formal apparatus through which the government works. and Montesquieu's perspective on spirit of laws, that is constitutional system of government, separation of powers, rule of law, all of them have had a bearing on the bigger perspective, the context of the working of the government. And herein we see that liberal democratic government with separation of power, independent judiciary, system of checks and balances, that is system of government in which people consent to their rulers, all of them today have become very important while as we deliberate on the historical context of modern government. Now, as we understand the historical context of the modern government, an important work that we must deliberate on, because this work has a lot, and that why we must reflect on, because this work presents to us significant inputs to deliberate on with respect to issues that are there in our everyday reality. Francis Fukuyama, an American political theorist. Now, in his very important work, The End of the History and the Last Man. Now, this work, coming with the collapse of communism in Soviet Russia, with the victory of liberal democracy and capitalism, somewhere gives a very deep insight with respect to the historical context of modern government. Now, what happens here is that in the magazine National Interest, there was an essay that was published, The End of History. And what happens here is that there is a book 3 years later, roughly 3 years later, the book that is The End of History and the Last Man. Now, this book talks about triumph of liberal democracy. It hints towards the arrival of a post-ideological world. And this is very essential that the context before it, the context of world polity before it, that is, we have seen that how the First World War leads to the Second World War, namely how the Treaty of Versailles paves way for the rise of the Second World War. The end of Second World War witnesses the world being divided into two different ideological camps, namely the capitalist camp versus the communist camp. Here in which once again there was somewhere a churning that which better ideology would cater to work out a better government. Now, with the end of Cold War, what is essential here is the important aspect. Francis Fukuyama's work, The End of History and the Last Man, tells us that is the end of Cold War marks the end point of the development of human history. Now, this is very essential to understand that how history has always played a very important role, and history as a discipline is always seen from the perspective of change from one phase to the other. But Fukuyama's work is hinting towards at the end of Cold War, it led to the end point, the cessation of development of human history. To quote Francis Fukuyama from his work, that is, it is not necessary that all societies become successful liberal societies, merely that they end their ideological pretensions of representing different and higher forms of human society. So, therefore, there is a caution that yes, liberal democracy has triumphed, and especially when we try to look at government through the history, the finality comes with the liberal democracy. But the very idea that this is the highest form of human society, somewhere it has to be understood in a deeper manner. Francis Fukuyama further says, and we quote, "What we are witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War or a passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such. That is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government." So, what we see here is that government, when we look at it in a historical context, from Athens to Rome to the feudal time government or to capitalism and industrialization, where liberal democracy, individual freedom, all of them played a very important role, Fukuyama hints that this history is moving towards a final form, and that is with the perspective of a universal Western democracy. Now, as we understand Francis Fukuyama's work, he draws on the philosophy of German philosopher Hegel. Hegel defined history as a linear procession, namely George Wilhelm Hegel's concept of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And the important aspect to note here is that history as evolving through conflict between different ideas. Further, this also contrasts with the work of other theorists, namely when we try to understand Fukuyama, Karl Marx in his work Communist Manifesto had argued that the entire divisions in society, namely the division between haves and haves not, Karl Marx reinterpreting Hegel's dialectical idealism with dialectical materialism, looking at the division of society from the Greek city-states to Roman times to feudal times to industrial revolution or to the capitalist time, the society was divided into two classes, that is the rich and the poor. And Karl Marx argued that current democracy would be replaced by socialist state. Now, herein Fukuyama contrasts, his work is a definite contrast to the ideas of Karl Marx, that is, he points towards the failure of communism, looking at the disintegration of USSR or the Soviet Union, looking at the fall of the Berlin Wall. We all know that how Germany was divided into East Germany and West Germany based on the different ideological aspect, which definitely guided the working of government also. So with the fall of Berlin Wall marking the end of the ideological conflict, the impact here is what Fukuyama presents here is that is unchallenged supremacy or the establishment of Western liberal democracy as the final stage of human evolution. Now, this is very important to understand, especially when we try to look into that how, when we look at the modern government has had a huge history. And in this history, from the Greek to the Rome to the feudal to the capitalist and industrial times, the end of Cold War, the failures of communism and the benefits offered by liberal democracy is what makes Fukuyama believe that this would be the last stage of human evolution. Now, herein once again when we look at important perspectives from Fukuyama's work, he looks at ancient Greek and he argues that liberal democracy is the only system of government. So now herein there is discussion on the benefits that liberal democracy can offer. That is, it is the only system which is good for what Plato said. Plato claimed to be necessary for happiness, the appetitive, the reasoning, knowledge and the truth and the need to be recognized as humans. So herein what we see here is that how Fukuyama's perspective is very essential to deliberate on that how liberal democracy is today seen as the most accepted and celebrated form of government, namely because of the benefits it offers from the welfare perspective to cater to the people. He also draws on Nietzsche in his work, and that is he points out that new order may lack sufficient challenges to inspire the work, the greatness and that previously characterized human societies. So therefore, it is also essential that what does he account to for the triumph of liberal democracy as an important government form as well as ideology. And there are two important answers that one gets. First, development of the scientific method. Science which offers accuracy, right perspective, rationality and pragmatism. And related to it, Fukuyama points out the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution wherein the liberal democratic government, somewhere they both have an important similarity of individual freedom, the need to have law and order in right place by the government authority, and above all, the need to value individual enterprise with respect to the trade apparatus. So therefore, he also points out that when we look at previous forms of government, we all know government have many forms, but Fukuyama's work, while especially looking at the historical context of modern government, he points out that monarchy and communist dictatorships, previous forms of government have failed. Further, what we see here is that within the free market capitalism, that is, this is the economic system that is compatible with liberal democracy. Today, many countries of the world are working or are celebrating the idea of liberal democracy with capitalism, and the important reason for that is that it provides the opportunity for success, for individual enterprise, for innovation, and many important incentives for exploration. Now, also important to understand that is history for Fukuyama. Of course, he reinterprets Hegel, tries to critique Karl Marx, looks at the end of the Cold War, but he also points out that history pertains to an important message, and that message is final resolution of tensions which drive history forward. Now, as we understand Francis Fukuyama's work of End of History and The Last Man, it is very essential to look at the alternate perspective too. Herein, the work of Samuel P. Huntington in his book The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. This book tells us that how one has to look at the end of history in a bigger sense. It may just not happen, rather because the cultural forces, if we go by the argument by Samuel P. Huntington, the cultural forces will take over the ideological forces in shaping the global history. So therefore, it is very essential that as we try to deliberate on historical context of modern government, at the outset, one must understand that government has been an important pillar, an important arm, an important element of the state. So therefore, when we look at the historical context of the modern government, the functions of the government with respect to power, with respect to rule, with respect to the important role it plays in management of politics and state policy has to be factored in. Now, modern government, when we look at its present form, it has evolved over time. Government may have different political apparatus, from a democracy to monarchy to oligarchy, and an example of that is what one can get from the Greek city-states, wherein Athens was a direct democracy, Sparta had a monarchy. So therefore, governments may have different apparatus, but the important role that government has played and will be playing, that is with respect to execution of the state policy for law and order, for welfare, amongst others. There may be a debate, namely with respect to the scope of the government. Today, one looks at the debate between governance versus government, wherein the scope of government is looked from the political, formal, institutional perspective, and the scope of governance is way much wider, wherein one looks at the study of political processes, the societal mechanisms, amongst others. So today, this is also having an important bearing as we understand the historical context of the modern government. Modern government, when we look at that, the way it has come in long way from the American Declaration of Independence, Treaty of Westphalia, French Declaration of Rights of Man, work of John Locke, J.S. Mill, amongst others, Montesquieu, rule of law perspective, and looking at the fact that how today liberty, equality and justice are important pillars to guide the work of the government, it is essential that when we look at this bigger framework of historical context of modern government, Francis Fukuyama's work, The End of History and The Last Man, hints towards that how the narrative of the development of human history and the government thereof comes to an end with the end of the Cold War. Because with the triumph of liberal democracy, end of Cold War, one has to see with the failure of communist model, the ideological conflict goes towards the advantage of liberal democracy, and herein liberal democratic government has been an important aspect with respect to the ideological, the final ideological stage of human evolution. Fukuyama's work, drawing from Nietzsche, criticizing Karl Marx, drawing on Hegel, definitely points that how today free market capitalism, liberal democracy with the justice, liberty, equality are very important with respect to the functioning of modern day government. But in the same light, one has to see that just like no concept has any finality, it is open to further contestations by the working of the society, by the new inputs and challenges from the polity. So same with liberal democratic government too. It has its own challenges when we look at the contemporary world and domestic governance realm with the rise of new threats as well as challenges. Dear learners, we hope that the lecture presented you significant inputs on the historical context of modern government. We look forward to positive, encouraging feedback from you all. Thank you very much.